Now, you might be thinking, what about the good that people do, like the guy who is a helpful neighbor or the person who offers aid at the site of an accident? How about the wealthy person who donates millions to further the study of cancer research? Where does this good come from? Now, we've not talked about the nature of God much yet, but He is a God who is infinite, meaning without limits, in His goodness and His rightness and His justice. Why is there any good in the world? Because it pleases God to have good in the world. If God did not control the degree of sin and wickedness in the world, there would be no trace of any goodness at all if what I said about the human heart after the fall is true. Now, how does God do this? Well, it's called common grace. It is God showing favor that mankind does not deserve by holding back the ravages of human sinfulness. This common grace applies to all people, regardless of whether or not they believe in God. The Bible tells us that the sun shines on the wicked and the good. Evil men still receive food and shelter and experience the good things that are found in God's creation. But this will not always be the case, for a day is coming when God will no longer extend His goodness to people who do not care for Him. This common grace of God is seen in the fact that sin is not allowed to have unrestrained control in the world. God restrains the wickedness of men in various ways, and one way in which God does this is called gereral revelation. God has revealed Himself in creation as well as in the human heart. To look at the creation we live in, the beauty of this earth, or the grandeur of a colorful sunset, or the vastness of the night sky, it's hard to come to the conclusion that this all happened by chance, that somehow two charged particles of stellar dust just happened to collide together, and our Earth being one of the results of this collision. I think that's a fantastic notion. We know from our own experience that a great work of art simply does not just happen, but is produced at the hands of an artist. A bridge or a huge skyscraper does not simply appear, but it's the result of the design of an architect and the work of builders. The Bible declares that this is so. In Romans chapter 1 we read, "For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead. So they are without excuse." That means everyone. This knowledge of God as Creator logically leads to the fact that we are also the creation of this God, and we are subject to Him. Now, God also restrains sin and promotes decent behavior in humanity by placing in the human heart knowledge of moral right and wrong. Remember, Adam and Eve before the fall knew only of right and reflected God's character perfectly. After the fall, they were made aware of moral wrong. And now this is true of us as well. Now, we are motivated to do right, but not by a pure heart that wants to please God, but from other things. The motivation comes from wanting to avoid things like the discomfort of a guilty conscience, or the staining of our good reputation, or the pain that we would cause those we care for, or the fear of punishment from the authorities. However, you can see that these motivations are selfish and therefore sinful before God. To put the problem of human sinfulness in a nutshell, it's like this. Because of the fall, mankind lost the perfect image of God it once reflected. Mankind is now dead to the things of God and cannot do anything that is truly pleasing to Him. Now, the will of man is free to operate only in the nature it possesses, which is a sinful nature. And because of God's infinite goodness, rightness, and justice, He can't allow His sinful creatures to have fellowship with Him, for that would be to deny His own character. We've all transgressed the law of God, and those who break God's law will suffer the consequences. Now, more about the law of God. There's a relationship between sin and the law of God. Remember, from the beginning, Adam and Eve were subject to God's law. It was one simple command: don't eat the fruit of one particular tree. Here we see that even in their morally perfect state, they were under the authority of a higher and greater moral being. Sin came into existence in the human arena by the breaking of this one law. Now remember, before I said that sin is a corruption of something pure. In one sense, it was the nature of man, but in another equally true sense, it is the corruption of keeping God's law. The Bible helps us here in 1 John. We read, "Whoever commits sin also commits lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness." Now, the first thing to say about God's law, as found in the Ten Commandments, is that it is the embodiment of the very character of God. Before the fall, the first couple had perfect and correct knowledge of the goodness and rightness of God. Obedience to the Ten Commandments would have been automatic. After the fall into sin, this knowledge, like everything else about them, was twisted and distorted. So not only do these commands show us what kind of character God has, they also show us what's required of us if we are to live in a way that pleases Him. And considering what we've talked about regarding human sinfulness, this is not good news. This law was given to God's special people, the Jews. Here now is a compressed history of how they came to be God's people in distinction to all the other nations. Remember that one of the curses that God gave to the serpent in the garden was that the seed or descendant of the woman, Eve, would crush the serpent's head. When Adam and Eve had their first son, they surely thought that this was the seed that God had spoken of. However, Cain turned out to be a bad seed. Cain ended up killing his younger brother Abel out of jealousy. Then Adam and Eve had another son, Seth. Seth was the beginning of a special line of descendants through which the promised seed would come. From Seth comes a long line of descendants until we come to Noah. Noah had 3 sons, and the Bible tells us that the Lord saw the wickedness of man on the earth, that every intent of the heart of man was on evil only. So God was sorry that He made man, and He said, "I will destroy man who I have created on from the face of the earth." But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. So God judges mankind with the great flood and reduces the world population to 8 individuals: Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives. After 40 days and 40 nights of nautical rocking and rolling with all the animals, the waters slowly recede. Then God promises Noah, "I will establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood." Now it's Shem, one of Noah's sons, that is highlighted in Genesis as the father of Terah, who becomes the father of Abram. And it is Abram that we see God's chosen line of descendants really start to take shape. Abram is told by God to go out of the land in which he lives to a land that God would show him. So he sets out from a place called Ur, modern-day Iraq, and heads towards Canaan, modern-day Israel, with the promise that he would be the father of a great nation. God continues to promise Abram that he would be the father of not only one nation, but of many nations. God even changes his name to Abraham, which means father of a multitude. Abraham and his wife Sarah were old when God promised them that they would have a child. Even though this couple tried to help God out by Abraham having a child with their Egyptian maid Hagar, God kept His promise. And at a very old age, Sarah gave birth to a son, Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob. From Jacob came 12 sons who, along with their households, settled in Egypt and began to multiply. They are the beginning of the 12 tribes of Israel. And from one of these tribes, Levi, came the birth of Moses during the persecution of the Jewish people in Egypt. It was through Moses, a Jewish man brought up in the courts of the Pharaoh, that God delivered His people from their slavery into freedom. It was also through Moses that God gave His people the law. Now the law was given to Moses in a very dramatic way. God descends upon Mount Sinai in fire and smoke and great racket. And while the Israelites trembled in fear at the base of the mountain, Moses went up to meet with God. And God said to Moses, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the bondage of Egypt. Because I have done this for you and your people, show your love for me by obeying me in a particular way." He goes on to give Moses 10 commands that will define not only who God is and what He requires from His creatures, Jews and non-Jews alike, but also will define the depth of our problem as sinful humans from that time forward.